დღის მეორე ღონისძიება შეხვედრა პოლონელ მწერალ Jacek Dehnelთან და არაჩვეულებრივ მაგდა ნოვაკოვსკასთან. Meeting with Jacek Dehnel in conversation with the wonderful, the beautiful Magda Nowakowska. Thank you for being with us, and please take the stage. Thanks.
Yes, that's working. So, thank you very much. The pleasure is absolutely ours, and let's start from the book that is already published in Georgian, because others are still awaiting, and I'm sure that it will happen. But just to introduce Jacek to you very briefly, because being a man of many talents, he is a writer, but both fiction and poetry, as well as a brilliant translator and a painter. So, Jacek, welcome again in Tbilisi.
Thank you for having me here.
And as I said, let's start from the book that is already translated into English. And I have to say, this was a book that I read when I was in my 20s, and it was written by Jacek when he was in his 20s, and it was a brilliant entry to his career. The book is called Lala, and the same title was preserved in Georgian translation, and the book made at that time a profound impression on me, I have to say, and this was our generation's new literature, I would say. This was absolutely a new word for us, a new way of storytelling in a language that we probably didn't have before in our generation. So you were moving forward, but you were somehow also moving backwards, moving back to some greater roots, I would say. Mm-hmm. And 20 years after, well, let's first start perhaps by introducing Lala herself, right?
Okay.
And who is she 20 years after, just, you know.
Okay. Yes, Lala is my grandmother, but it's a nickname. And I think it's actually quite similar to Georgian language, that you have longer names and then you change it into those short ones. And they often repeat the syllables as well. So my grandmother is Lala, but in that generation you would have all those women who were called Buba, Jija, Giga, and so on. So so she was born in 1919, and basically when Poland regained independence like Georgia. So basically her life was the life of Poland in 20th century, and also, well, she was just a magnificent storyteller. I think this is the basic thing. And you know, when you are a young writer, you very often have problems with finding something to speak about, a subject for a book, because first of all, your language skills are improving, but they are not that great at a young age. And secondly, you just don't have the material. You're a young person. You just ceased to be a teenager. I started writing that book when I was 20, and I finished it when I was 22. So my life was on its early stages still, and I didn't have much to speak about, but I had this great collection of stories that my grandmother used to tell us. And she was one of those people who just, you know, give you tea, and whoever you were just sitting in her living room, and she would start telling stories, and she would jump, you know, from one subject to another. She was such a sort of machine, just needed like a tiny word, and would just go from one story via digression to another story, and to another story, and to another story, and then 5 hours later you'd be given another cup of tea. So so we had all of that, and we remembered those stories by heart. And what was crucial in that very moment is that my grandmother started to lose her memory. So this book, on one hand, is this story about her life. It all starts back in Kiev. She was illegitimate children of two people who were married. They had their own marriages. They had love affair, and then they got divorced and got married afterwards. After a few years, her mother was Polish. Her father was Ukrainian, but I think with more Russian identity. It was very, very mixed back then, and he moved to Poland after the revolution. He managed to escape 5 years after the revolution. He came to Poland and he stayed there. So this is the story that starts back in Kiev, and then it's all this story of interbellum in Poland, her childhood, the Jewish community in Poland, then the Second World War, the Holocaust, and also the end, more or less, of her social class. So my grandmother was, she was brought up in a manor, in a small manor, and this social class was completely wiped out by the communists later on. So she obviously lost her house and the fields and everything, but they persisted as this social class called intelligentsia, and she and her story is basically history of this social class in 20th century in Poland. So I wrote down those magnificent stories, like really funny and entertaining and sad and touching, like all walks of life basically, dramatic and funny. And at the same time, I was recording this whole process of losing memory, and this very special between the grandchildren and grandparents, who sort of the grandchildren that take over certain traditions and points of view without their parents in the middle. It's sort of a bridge between those two generations, skipping the generation of parents, which I think is a very typical thing in many cultures. And that's how this book was conceived. And I had this very deep belief that this is not just my grandmother's story, that this is much more universal, especially in terms of Poland, but perhaps also in other countries. And actually, yes, I had hard time publishing it. This book took 4 years to be published after it was finished, but when it was published, it was a big success. There's a lot of, I know, a dozen of translations, 15 translations, can't remember. And it's very interesting for me how people in other countries will also come and say, okay, you know, I had a very similar grandma. My grandma was just like that. I have the same experience, and also this experience of taking care of a senile person who loses memory and who changes into a person with different personality because of this illness. This is something that we encounter more and more, because of course our societies are more and more old, and we start to have problems with those particular illnesses of the old age, and this is a growing, part of our experience as the younger generations.
And it is exactly my feeling about the book. My initial feeling was that it was bridging in a beautiful way something that we have lost in between, and something that was the fate of our parents' generation, wasn't it? Just because they had grown up in the post-war world in absolutely new political reality, which was already the socialist bloc. And all that heritage that you're talking about was suppressed, was being wiped out, was being persecuted. I mean, families like yours and many others, and I can relate to that. And we were deprived of property and so on and so forth. So the whole entire bridging between the new generation that picked up from the world that was seemingly lost and translating it into a new reality, it was not simply a good storytelling. It was not simply something that entered with a good story, but I think it was also reclaiming, regaining that's heritage to my feeling back then.
Well, yes, and my grandmother was sort of very adamant about it. So, like, she did not acknowledge, in a way, the changes in society. So, I mean, like, she was obviously the part of a very privileged social group before the war. But she never, you know, idealized it in terms of how it was the good old times. Like, she was
Above
very,
somehow.
no, but she was also very conscious that there was a lot of poor people, poor peasants in the village where she lived, and that it was absolutely unjust and it's not as it should have been. And she was very leftist, but in terms of, you know, Western democratic socialism, not in terms of hard-boiled communism. So she had this, you know, sense of her own social privilege, and she was not into, you know, sort of rebooting the past as it was. But at the same time, she felt that we, with, well, not having money, we still preserve some part of our heritage, which is sort of non-material. So it was literature, it was, she had this very strong opinions about small children, and she would like say, oh, how is it possible that you are 8 years old and you still don't remember, and you still don't know the storyline of Hamlet? And she would start, of course she would tell roughly the story of Hamlet. So I remember that. And this is also interesting how she mixed all those things, so like the Greek myths, and stories from her childhood, and Hamlet, and you know, all these things just came together. And as a small child, I had difficulties in discerning them. So like, I felt like the Greek gods and Bolsheviks, and it's sort of the same part of the same story, and Hamlet and Macbeth and all of that. Like it happened a long time ago, and my grandmother has a sort of first-hand experience of all of that. But and she would like, for instance, say, oh, you have to behave well, because what happens if you are invited for tea by the Queen of England, and so you have to have, you know, your manners, because what happens then? You cannot behave like a boor in presence of Queen of England. So part of it was playful, but behind that there was a sense that, you know, a better time will come.
And I think this is something that many people in Georgia can relate to. Because
That's why I'm saying
that. Because exactly the universal theme in our part of the world is the annihilation of elites and the loss that the society suffered because of that. And this is why I think that this is the, you were saying about this universal element about it, and I think that resonates very, very deeply with Georgians, with Central European countries, but not only. Particularly, but not only, because there's also the element of, as you said, the bridging, you know, because the skip of the generation. But thank you for that. And I want to move on to another book that you have just finished, which is also a voluminous fiction book,
no,
right?
Non-fiction.
The story.
Non-fiction.
Oh, this is exactly, no, because it is based actually on a real story.
This is not my first non-fiction
I haven't
book.
read it because it's in the publishers right now. Literally, you finished it, what, 2-3 months ago?
Yeah, it's being edited.
It's being
with
edited.
Great problems. It's like 1,000 pages, and they have huge problems.
But it is also based on a real story that is hidden in your family, and from what you told me, and I can guess myself, it is a sort of a detective story, but also, obviously, there must be love there. There must be love affairs, but there are spies, there's everything. And in the middle of it, there is a very precious set for tea, no? For
Porcelain set, like
porcelain
huge.
set, right? So
Yes.
what is happening with this porcelain set?
It's called the Swans, and it's like the main subject, like it's pivoting around this focus of the Swan set, which was the largest set that the Meissen porcelain factory produced in the 18th century. That was the first place in Europe when people mastered how to produce porcelain, which before was only brought from the Far East. And there was this omnipotent minister, Heinrich von Brühl, Count von Brühl, who was the minister of Prince of Saxony and King of Poland. And he was the director of many, many, many things, including the manufacture. And he had this huge set of 2,200 pieces made for him, which was in times when sets for kings were 400 pieces. So he was like far better than a king. And it featured swans. So it had a very dramatic history. And after the war, the palace of Brühl family, when Poland's borders were moved, the palace of the von Brühl family suddenly became part of Poland. We've lost our lands in the east, we gained some lands of former Germany, and that's where the porcelain set was. And it was plundered and sold into pieces. Now it's all over the world in many collections. And members of my family were instrumental in distributing those magnificent pieces of porcelain. So the whole story is a story about my family, but not very close. It's not like my grandmother. It's also on my father's side, not on my mother's side. Sister of my other grandmother married this very rich boy who came from a very privileged family. They had a hotel, a factory, and they were a very rich pre-war family, and they've lost large part of it during the war. And as their father had just one skill, he had a collection of art and he knew about art, he established this private shop with antiques just right after the war in the communist state. Of course, it was taken from him by the state after a year, but he managed to acquire and sell these pieces of this magnificent swan set. But the story goes further, and this is a story of a huge affair that took place in 1970s. So between 1940s and 1970s, there was this whole operation of bringing illegally, smuggling gold from Switzerland, selling it in Poland for dollars, and bringing dollars back to Switzerland. And it was sort of machination that brought a lot of money. And they were using Brazilian diplomats to smuggle it. And altogether, it was 16 tons of gold, so a large operation, and also pieces of art, and a huge legal case in late 70s.
Because obviously the case was discovered, the procedure was discovered.
Yes.
And then there was a huge court case.
There was a huge court case which was heavily used by propaganda. They deliberately picked people to this case to make a propaganda statement, and the state was blackmailing the state of Brazil to get some money. It's sort of diplomatic operation of Secret Service, like extremely weird thing, and it was so important that the Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs was personally editing all the articles for press describing that, and there were very few journalists that were allowed to write about it, who are actually collaborators of the Secret Service partially, and that was the deputy minister who was editing that. So that was, and again, like with Lala, this is not only about this family, this is not only about this case, this is about our collective memory, our like the wide fresco of the society in communist times and pre-war times. And it has two parts. So the first part is the family memory. So members of the family, because all the people who were actually taking part in that already died. So it's the next generation, and they are telling how they remember this whole affair and the whole thing and the family. And the second volume, second part, is about what is written in the actual documents of the legal case. So the interrogations, the court proceedings, etc., etc., and of course reports of the secret police and the Secret Service, etc., etc. So those two stories, of course, are completely different. So the first is called the Swans, and the second part is called the Black Pond, because those
That
stories
this-
are completely
that
different.
the swan fell in. Yes, the black pond that the swan fell in.
Yes.
The beautiful, precious swan. I'm so much looking forward to read it. And when you mention this background of, society and of details of the epoch, not only one, but there are a few because it moves throughout some couple of them. But when you said that, it reminded me of something else that you're doing actually, which is detective stories that you co-write with your husband and under an alias, and they have great popularity in Poland because also, again, they are a very realistic description of the times that the story is set in, to the very last detail. It's lovely itself. Also, they are very good detective stories, and I'm sure you have fun doing them and figuring out the plot and playing with it. But that is something that is very typical for what you do.
Well, yes, but that is the idea of my husband, so I'm just writing that. He is the inventor of it, he's co-writing that, and he does all the research, almost all the research, but he's a historian, so he's really well established into the researching things from the past. All of that takes place in 1890s, early 1900s. So in Poland, which is under the German, Russian, and Austrian rule. In this case, this is Krakow. Krakow is under the Austrian Empire, and we deliberately picked a female protagonist. So this is very much a men's world back then. Women don't have much rights, many rights. They cannot vote, obviously. They are starting to be allowed at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, which is also one of the subjects of one of the volumes. And the main protagonist is just a very nosy wife of a professor. So she's privileged, she does not have children, so she is not doing what the society is also expecting from her. She cannot have children, and she's trying to figure out to do something in her life, and she finds out that it's going after murders, it's her thing, and she's very good at that. And what is important, she cannot be a policewoman back then, or a detective, so she's doing that clandestine. She's not telling that to her husband, and she also is using her position as a professor's wife, so someone relatively important in the society, but also a woman. So she can enter some places that men could not, and she can talk to some people that men would not, and she has ways. She's blackmailing people in this very subtle, charming way. Yes, so we have a pen name which is female. We have a female protagonist, and that's since the very beginning that was our idea to write a sort of very feminist, progressive crime novels about times which were totally not progressive.
And this is how we move to your another skill and talent, and I would say even the initial one, because you first were recognized as a poet. Yeah. At least this is the anecdote I've heard from Warsaw. When you were walking still as a student through the main street in Warsaw, someone pointed at you, and I heard it from my husband, and he said, the person that knew you pointed, and he was like, "Oh my God, this is the most dangerous poet in Warsaw." So that has been a joke with us, but I don't know how dangerous you are, but
I don't really think so. No.
I do like, and I do like your poetry, and it is here I hold your last book of poetry, also with the painting by Jacek on the cover. And it is called Bruma. Let's perhaps first start with the title, shall we?
It's the title of one of the poems, and Bruma in Latin is this lowest part of winter. It's like the longest night, the shortest day. It's like it's a bad place to be. It's cold, it's dark, but there is an expectation that it's going to get better. So I wrote it in Poland these days, and I think you can easily relate in Georgia to Bruma, in spite of a very nice weather, to like the mental state that we are in Poland. And because of that, this is not an optimistic collection of poems, I would say, and there's a lot of dark poems and things that really trouble us. So this is the situation at the Polish border, of the refugees at the Polish border, is the situation of the war in Ukraine, of the Russian invasion, is the situation of the LGBT people in Poland, which is not easy either. So there are some poems which are like very engaged politically, perhaps, but on a different level, because I do believe that poetry at its very core is a magical art. So it's all about incantations and this way of conveying messages secretly and just getting them into people's minds by kind of magic. And I would say that this magic is, one of those powers of this magic is empathy. So poetry, by a precise art of combining words together, can make you feel things through empathy that you would not feel otherwise. And of course, I always repeat that a cut in your finger hurts much more than someone else's leg torn away, but through empathy, you can feel someone else's pain. And I think poetry has a way of doing that. It's largely between the words. It's not the words that you are actually saying, but it's something magically happening between the words. And this goes all the way back to the mythical beginnings of poetry, and Orpheus, who had this way of playing harp and singing the way that dangerous beast would become meek and nice. So I think this is something poetry should do in these days.
I would say that when faced with things that make us numb, poetry can come to our aid.
Yes, and
poetry is sometimes, I mean, to me, and reading this book of poetry, I found a lot of it. When we fall short of words, we go to poetry, I would put it this way. And there is, I'm sorry, because you wanted to say something.
No, that's fine, that's true. I concur.
Because there is one poem that moved me particularly, and it was written in April 22, and please tell me about this poem, because we also have English translation, and I will ask you if you could kindly read it as well, but please tell me about this poem.
I just want to say to this great person who is translating us that we do not expect to have it translated in real time as poetry. Sadly, we don't have this poem in Georgian yet.
Not yet.
This is something that I just wrote about my real practice. So when the Ukrainian cities started to be razed and destroyed to the ground, I started to go on Google Maps because you can still see the same places when they were still untouched. And you can just observe little lives of people in a normal way, as you always can watch that on Google Maps. And with this feeling that none of that is existing, and perhaps many of those people are already dead or heavily traumatized, and most probably not in those places. But somehow I also had this, feeling of that I have no authority to do it. So, this is my work of empathy and trying to understand it and trying to mourn these people whom I don't know. But also I find that it's very important that we do not feel the war in the way that the actual victims feel it. Because especially in Poland, there is this expectation now that the Polish writers will start to write about war in Ukraine. Because, you know, Ukrainians are busy, so we should do it for them, which is, I think, very stupid and arrogant. Because no matter how empathic you are, you cannot feel other people's trauma. I rarely speak about the war in Ukraine in my poems. There are a few poems about that in this book. But I always take the position of someone who is out of this picture, who is not the direct victim of it, who is just someone taking a stance, saying, I'm on this side of the victims, I'm not on the side of perpetrators. But I never want anyone to think that I'm among the victims. I'm not. I can be sympathetic, but I do not usurp this place who totally belongs to victims.
I think it is a very fair stance. And may I ask you to read that poem?
Sure, yes. It is a translation of Karen Kowacik. Sadly, we did not have time to ask her for that, but I hope Karen agrees and she will not be offended by the fact. She's my great translator. I really respect her work a lot, also being a translator of poetry, and I think she's a great poet and translator herself. And the title Tenebrae Responsoria is a title of songs that are sung in the Catholic Church during the Good Week. So when Christ is dead and he dies on the cross and he's buried, there are those dark songs. They are literally the dark songs who are being sung in the church. So it's again like Bruma is the darkest moment. I'm not religious, I'm atheist, but it's just a very good figure of what I was feeling back then. Tenebrae Responsoria. I started to walk after they bombed the theater full of children. Always at night, always alone in my room. Walking feels shameful, because why do it? In the name of what? Who gave me the authority? At first, I'd sneak away like a tourist to take in the major sights. On Google Maps, everything's still standing. Only water is striking the fountain in front of the drama theater. Beside it, a girl on the stairs with a dachshund. Someone nags a child that he shouldn't get wet. You can see each tree down to its last tiny leaf. A young couple stands at the end of the pier. They've hung a bag on the railing and gaze at the sea, the western sun. And when you rotate, two men, a woman in a slouchy hat pulled low, and a girl of 8 or 9 in a black jacket with a hood, forever without faces. Before the Illichivets Stadium, an expanse of cheap concrete pavers, and a woman in a blue coat is walking with her son, both preceded by long afternoon shadows. On the opposite side, another woman in a pink blouse with short sleeves. It's late summer. And beside her, a little daughter in a matching shirt is riding a bike, also in that same improbably lifelike color on dull asphalt. Then I started to walk further, to less obvious locations. Information about this site might no longer be current. Always take into account reports of recent events, as the situation is subject to change. In the premium apartments, a black fireplace. In the hotel Chaika, you can turn around in the bathroom. Everything's still pristine. White towels and bathrobe, a pair of slippers in their cellophane wrapper. In the library of the Polytechnic University, computers, not yet stolen, give off a silver glow. Here a fence with a cracked post, buried in fall leaves. There an ugly office tower that has not yet not yet been bombed, with an ATM still unshuttered near blades of grass, spring green and tender. No one's around, just a couple of cars absolutely intact. At the intersection, two women chat, one with a black dog, a courtyard grey mural with a guy hunched under a table, then a narrow bridge where a boy carries a blue watering can under his arm. Down below, a dual sky-colored train. Over time, I became a long-distance runner. I moved then to my city, walk on the sunny side to the arched entrance of my street, as if the entrance and the whole street no longer existed, as if everyone had been shot, driven out, hauled away. The old woman in the white sweater, one hand on the fence post, the other on her cane, is not there. From the building, only 3 floors remain, and on the top one, there is a bed with its guts exposed. And here's our old cafe, and here of those sitting at the little tables, maybe someone survived or maybe not. Even if the placard announced the soup, mini quiche and croissant combo will always be there for 25 zlotys. On Google Maps, my city is still standing, but I walk through it as if we're already gone, as if no one knew whether it would again exist. You have to practice to not lose proficiency. So I shake my city from my eyes, like the guy in the green t-shirt standing on one leg, jostling a stone from his white sneaker, which he doesn't yet know is a piece of rubble.
Jacek, I think with this point we could finish our conversation, which I hope we continue next time with Georgian translation of your poems and your books. Thank you very much. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me at the festival. It really is a great pleasure to be here. Thank you.